Imagine risking your life every morning, knowing that for every 10 stories of steel rising into the sky, someone on your crew would never walk home again. In the first decades of America's skyscraper boom, death was not just an accident. It was an expectation, baked into contractors' budgets and ignored by city planners. Why did building the skyline demand so much blood? And what was life really like for the men who walked narrow steel beams 30 stories above the street, where one slip meant oblivion? To understand, you have to step out onto the iron. Steel skeletons rose above Manhattan, floor by floor, until the city's heartbeat thrummed hundreds of feet in the air. For the men who built these towers, the workday began with a climb, sometimes 30 stories straight up, ending not on a stable platform but on a sliver of iron. The beams beneath their boots measured just 8 to 12 inches across, the width of a man's shoe with nothing but air on either side. Wind whipped between unfinished walls, tugging at shirts and rattling loose bolts. Below, the city moved on, its noise reduced to a distant hum, while up here every step was a negotiation with gravity. Balance wasn't just a skill, it was a lifeline. Iron workers learned to keep their eyes fixed ahead, never glancing down at the dizzying drop. Some carried lunch in one hand, tools in the other, striding across beams as if walking a sidewalk. But the margin for error was razor thin. A bead of sweat, a sudden gust, or a moment's distraction could turn a routine crossing into a fatal plunge. There were no harnesses, no nets, no second chances. The only thing between a man and the street was his own sense of equilibrium, and sometimes even that was not enough. The average skyscraper in the 1920s soared 30 stories or more, each new level stretching the limits of nerve and endurance. Workers moved along beams set in place by cranes, sometimes swaying in the wind, sometimes slick with rain or ice. The steel itself could vibrate underfoot, sending shivers through boots and bones alike. Yet the job demanded speed. Lingering meant holding up the entire crew, so men learned to trust their instincts and their feet, even as the world spun around them. Over time, the act of walking the beam became a kind of ritual, part bravado, part necessity. Stories passed among crews about men who danced across girders, joking and singing, as if to taunt the void below. But everyone knew the truth. A single misstep meant certain death. The city's skyline is built on moments like these, when a man's life balanced on 8 inches of steel, and the only thing holding him up was the courage to keep moving forward. A skyscraper's skeleton did not come together on its own. Every steel beam was locked in place by a team of 4, each man's role as precise as a watch gear. The heater crouched beside a portable forge, eyes stinging from smoke as he fished out a rivet glowing cherry red, hotter than the inside of a blast furnace, nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In a single motion, he tossed the rivet to the catcher, who waited across a gap, sometimes 20 feet away, perched on a narrow beam. The catcher's job was pure nerve and reflex. He snatched the searing metal out of the air with tongs or a battered tin bucket, then, without missing a beat, jammed it into a hole where 2 beams met. Next came the bucker. He pressed a heavy iron bar called a dolly against the rivet's rounded head to hold it steady from one side. Facing him, the gunman hefted a pneumatic rivet gun, an air-powered hammer that could drive steel into steel with a deafening roar. The gunman's trigger finger had to be perfectly timed. If he struck too soon, the rivet would bend or ricochet. Too late, it would cool and seize, leaving the joint weak. In that brief window, sometimes just 10 seconds, the whole crew had to move as one. The dance played out hundreds of times a day, every move choreographed by necessity and habit. But there was no margin for error. If the catcher missed, a 2,000-degree rivet could tumble through the skeleton, burning through flesh or igniting wood far below. If the bucker lost his grip, the dolly could slip and send a man tumbling. The roar of the gun drowned out warnings, and the heat sapped focus. Burns, smashed fingers, and falls were common. Sometimes a single mistake meant tragedy. No harnesses, no gloves thick enough to stop a burn, just raw skill and trust in the men beside you. Rivet gangs moved with a rhythm that was equal parts teamwork and survival. Each successful joint meant the building grew taller, but every misstep threatened to end a life. The risk was not just in the height, it was in the split-second timing, the relentless speed, and the knowledge that the job always demanded more. On the ground, the men who risked everything for a day's pay came from places where choices were few and hope was hard-earned. In New York, Irish and Italian immigrants crowded tenements, their names filling union rolls and payroll ledgers on every high-steel job. For many, the only alternative to the skyscraper was joblessness, or work so poorly paid that a family would go hungry. Word spread in boarding houses and church basements, ironwork paid more than any factory if you could handle the heights and the constant threat of loss. Men followed brothers, cousins, neighbors, each new hire pulled from the same village or city block, building invisible networks of trust high above the city streets. For the Mohawk men of Kanawake, the path to the skyline began north of the border. The story is still told by their children and grandchildren, how the first Mohawk crews were hired for the Victoria Bridge in 1886, proving themselves fearless and sure-footed. That reputation spread through word of mouth and union halls, until Mohawk ironworkers became a fixture on every major project from Montreal to Manhattan. By the 1920s, entire families from Kanawake and Akwesasne traveled south, some settling in Brooklyn's Little Caughnawaga, an enclave that pulsed with stories of men who walked the steel and sent wages back home. The Jay Treaty of 1794, reaffirmed in the courts in 1927, let them cross the border for work even when others could not. Descendants remember fathers and grandfathers leaving before dawn, driving all night, then climbing into the sky as soon as the sun rose. One recalls that his grandfather would say, "Don't look down, don't look back. Trust your feet and trust your brothers." Another remembers funerals that swept through the community after the Quebec Bridge collapse, when 33 Mohawk men were lost in a single day. The pain echoed for generations, shaping a tradition called booming out, spreading family members across different sites so no single disaster could take them all. These men were called skywalkers not because they lacked fear, but because they learned to carry it. The label became a badge of pride and sorrow. Community networks offered support, but also bound men to a trade that paid in both wages and wounds. For the Irish, Italians, and Mohawks alike, skyscraper work was more than a job. It was a bargain struck with fate, where the promise of a better life always came with a cost. Each step on the beam was a testament to survival, and every new floor built was paid for in blood, sweat, and the strength of the communities left waiting below. Contractors kept ledgers that treated death as just another line item. Insurance rates, not safety nets, shaped the math behind every new skyscraper. For the men making decisions in boardrooms, the cost of a human life was weighed against the price of a delay. If a worker fell, a payout to his family might run a few $1,000s, but a week lost to stricter safety measures could cost far more in wages and missed deadlines. In the 1920s, a leading New York firm quietly admitted that one worker died for every 33 hours on the job. That figure was not a scandal. It was a calculation. Liability insurance made it easier to accept loss. Policies covered accidental death, allowing companies to budget for fatalities in advance. The price of adding safety nets or slowing the pace for extra precautions often outweighed the expected claims. In some years, a contractor could insure an entire workforce for less than the cost of installing nets across a single floor. The ledger showed a clear preference: pay out after the fact rather than spend more to prevent disaster. Labor historians have uncovered correspondence in account books where deaths are listed alongside materials and overtime. The language is cold, settlement paid, claim closed, reflecting an industry that saw workers as interchangeable. Behind every number, there was a family left without a provider. But the men in charge rarely met the widows who came to collect. They saw only the balance sheet where speed and profit always came first. The insurance companies competed for contracts by promising quick settlements and minimal disruption. Some even offered rebates for low claim years, turning safety into a gamble. When accidents happened, the process was efficient. A foreman filled out a report, the insurer cut a check, and the job continued. There was no incentive to change unless the cost of death grew higher than the cost of prevention. Competition kept the system intact. This approach did not just shape individual tragedies, it set the stage for disasters on a massive scale. When the numbers favored risk, entire crews worked without nets, with nothing but hope and habit to keep them alive. In the end, the city skyline rose on a foundation of calculated loss, each ledger entry a quiet record of lives traded for progress. August 29, 1907 began like any other day for the crews working on the Quebec Bridge. By late afternoon, the air was thick with the clang of steel and shouted orders. Without warning, the bridge's southern span buckled. 75 men, ironworkers, engineers, laborers, plunged into the St. Lawrence River as thousands of tons of steel twisted and collapsed in seconds. The water below boiled with debris, and the cries of the injured were drowned by the groan of failing metal. 33 of the dead came from the Mohawk community in Kanawake, entire families shattered in a single moment. Rescue efforts stretched into the night, but there were few survivors. The official inquiry found that design flaws and ignored warnings doomed the bridge. Engineers had flagged bending steel weeks before, but the rush to complete the project and the refusal to halt work sealed the fate of everyone on the span. The disaster filled headlines across North America, but for the families left behind, there was only silence and loss. The bridge collapsed again in 1916, taking 13 more lives. 5 years later, the Equitable Building in Lower Manhattan became a symbol of a different kind of catastrophe. On January 9, 1912, fire broke out in the basement and raced upward through wooden scaffolding and open stairwells, trapping workers on the upper floors. Flames leapt from window to window as men tried to escape, some leaping to their deaths rather than be consumed. The city fire crews battled the inferno for hours, but 7 workers died, burned, suffocated, or crushed as floors gave way. Dozens more suffered injuries from burns and smoke. The building's steel frame held, but the interior was gutted. Official reports blamed the rapid spread on flammable construction materials and a lack of fireproofing. The coroner's inquest called for stricter codes and regular fire drills, but no laws changed. Insurance paid out the claims and work resumed. These tragedies were not isolated. They were warnings written in blood that the risks of high-rise construction went far beyond falls. Yet time and again the industry moved on with little more than a tally of the dead. Families mourned, but the skyline kept rising. The price of progress was measured in names etched on headstones, not in new regulations or safer practices. For the men on the next job, the lesson was clear. Catastrophe could strike without warning, and no one was coming to save them. Legends swirl around the Empire State Building's construction, with rumors of mass casualties haunting its legacy. Yet the project's own records tell a different story. 5 men lost their lives during the 13 months it took to raise the tower. Each death, whether from a truck accident, a fall, an explosion, a hoist, or a slip from scaffolding, was logged with precision. For a site that employed over 3,400 workers and climbed 102 stories, the official count stands out not for its scale, but for its scarcity. This outcome was no accident. Project managers enforced a level of discipline and oversight rare for the time. Daily safety briefings, strict crew assignments, and a tightly scheduled flow of materials left little room for improvisation. The building rose ahead of schedule and under budget, but not by gambling with lives. While most of the industry saw fatalities as inevitable, the Empire State's approach proved otherwise. Safety, it turned out, was not a fantasy, but a deliberate choice, one that paid off. Elsewhere, the lesson went largely ignored. Contractors on other skyscrapers still cut corners, skipping nets and harnesses to save time and money. The Empire State Building's record became an outlier, a quiet rebuke to an industry slow to change. The project showed that worker safety depended less on luck than on the priorities of those in charge. The Great Depression and the rise of organized labor forced a new reckoning. Federal relief programs like the Public Works Administration began attaching safety clauses to every contract. Inspectors now demanded guardrails, nets, and harnesses on all federally funded sites. Department of Labor bulletins spelled out the rules: no scaffolding without rails, no work at height without protection. For the first time, federal money came with conditions, and those conditions saved lives. Federal and enforced safety was becoming a requirement. As the 1930s progressed, the old acceptance of loss gave way to a new standard. The shift was not instant or universal. Private projects lagged, and enforcement varied. But the precedent was set. The Empire State's 5 deaths became a benchmark. The New Deal's labor clauses turned safety from a suggestion into a requirement for those willing to comply. Change came not from disaster, but from a conscious decision to do better, written into contracts and backed by the threat of lost funding. The skyline continued to rise, but now each floor reflected a growing respect for the lives of those who built it. Steel towers still rise, but the cost of progress is no longer measured in lives lost per floor. Yet construction remains among America's top 5 deadliest jobs today, with over 1,000 worker deaths each year. The skyline's beauty depends on vigilance, not just vision. Every city silhouette is a daily test. How much are we willing to risk for ambition? Share your thoughts below.